Someone else on there?
We, Hillary, are you able to? We have
We need a.
the AFA
There should be a need.
joining us apparently.
That's okay. That's all right. I'm used to that. Anyway, and as far as land in Scarborough, there's only 10 parcels for sale, at least on the MLX, which is basically residential. So I don't know what's going on with commercial particularly, although there's not a whole lot. The least expensive parcel land is a third of an acre for $172,000. And the most expensive parcel, it's a pretty large parcel. It's a 1.6 million. So, you know, we're dealing with numbers that just don't make sense in the real world. I shake my head even as a real estate broker. It's crazy out there. And I don't like it. And I see how it's affecting constituents in my town. People who would like to sell, elders in particular, who'd like to sell and downsize, can't sell because they have no place to go. I will say that the low income senior housing bond that was passed has been very helpful. We are starting to build some affordable senior housing in Scarborough, which is great. I'm all for that. I think it's awesome. And hopefully some of my folks will be able to get in on that. But we've got a long way to go. We have a lot of ordinances in Scarborough. I think we do a good job of staying up to date with ordinances and trying to, you know, make sure we're addressing affordability and workforce as best we can. But as you know, ordinances cut both ways. Some ordinances are very helpful and other ordinances restrict land use to some extent. And for good reason. I'm just talking about off the top of my head, I'm thinking of like septic rules, shoreline zoning, but those are in for a reason because we have to have this balance between developing land and protecting, you know, our environment and our way of life here in Maine. Scarborough does have a growth management ordinance where we only allow for 85 single family houses to be built in a year. We do exempt affordable, and I was able to get them to exempt up to 10 units of workforce housing in our new growth management, which hopefully will be helpful. But, you know, I'm going to cut to the chase here with you folks. I think it's great. You're looking at, you know, zoning and ordinances and whatnot, but the bottom line is money. I mean, that's just the way it goes. It's money. Senior bonds, the low income housing bonds, as I mentioned, I think have been successful. And personally, and I know I'm not the only one who feels this way, we would love to see some incentives such as low interest bonding or whatever for not just affordable housing, because there is some stuff out there, but there's this gap, that gap for workforce housing. And just for those of you who may not be familiar with it, the HUD definition of workforce housing is 80 to 120% of the area median. And in Scarborough, or I should say in the Portland, Maine statistical analysis area, for a family of four, that's an income of $123,000. And there is a huge gap. I can tell you as a real estate broker, I do specialize in two ends of the spectrum. I specialize in working with seniors who are looking to downsize. I also specialize in first-time home buyers. I love, you know, trying to help young folks get into housing, and it's been absolutely next to impossible, even with the low interest rates. I bet I make on average 5 to 6 offers for each person that I've managed to get into a house. And the housing that they get into is $30,000 to $40,000 over what the list price is. I just listed a very affordable condo in Old Orchard, a 2-bedroom for $195,000, just went under contract. And I had 15 offers. And I will tell you, it's going for a heck of a lot more than that affordable price. So thank you for looking at this issue. I know I'm stepping on the third rail here by saying I'd like to see some money, some bond money made available, particularly for workforce housing. And I am available at any time for anybody if they want to give me a call or if you have any questions at this point. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Counselor, for your testimony. I think what we'll do is we'll take questions from commissioners, if there are any. I probably will be asking all of you roughly the same question, which, unless I hear it during your presentation, but for my part, I guess I would be curious to hear what are some of the local discussions around ordinances. I know you made mention of a few that exist in Scarborough, obviously septic rules, shoreline zoning, but you also made mention of a rule that caps the number of houses that can be built. I think you said 85 single family homes per year, with an exemption for 10 affordable units. And I don't know if there was another exemption that I missed.
I'm sorry, Ryan.
Yep.
Excuse me, Mr. Speaker. There's an exemption for all affordable, and in all affordable, there's an exemption for 10 workforce. Because again, that's that gap area right now.
Can you walk us through the rationale for having such a cap?
Yeah, we have, well, I'll just give you an example. I was accused of calling people racist when we put the GMO in. There are a number of people who come from, let's say, some of the better heeled portions of town, and we have a few of them here in Scarborough, who, in my opinion, should know better. They come across, they consider themselves very liberal and this and that and the other thing. And we were doing the GMO and talking about affordable housing, increasing multi-unit housing, because Scarborough's not known for having, apartment buildings or places for people to rent, particularly. And we've got this new project, Scarborough Downs, which is opening up some opportunity there. And I got emails from folks who, and these are quotes, "We don't want that type of housing in Scarborough because it will affect the," and I'm going to put quotes again, "character of our town." And I called those folks out on what I thought was elitist and potentially racist, and they dragged me through the mud for about a month in the Scarborough Leader. But hey, that's the way it goes. I'll call it as I see it. And so, in Scarborough has a very interesting demographic there. We have old Scarborough, we've got new Scarborough. People don't want us to be north in Boston. I hear that a lot. And I mean, I get that. So that's the balancing act. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and just one other, you said these are single family homes, so not
right.
So for example, if a duplex was built, is that considered two, or is that considered one?
Two.
Okay.
And it's it's very interesting. And in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to do that, but again, it's that balancing act. And how do you balance? Because I personally, I believe everyone deserves a roof over their head, and it really upsets me when I get people who I say who should know better, who I think like I do, and they're like, "We don't want those people in town," is basically what they're saying. Right. So that's just something we're dealing with. And again, that's Scarborough. And I know that Maine's a big state and everyone's got different things they're dealing with in different areas of the state.
Commissioner Pingree.
Yes, thank you, Jean Marie. That was very helpful. And for not preparing, you had just a fountain of data and information. So really well done.
Thank you.
This is just sort of based on what I read in the newspaper, but certainly I think your comments reflect it. It seems that Scarborough is a fairly fast growing community. And obviously we're reading about Scarborough Downs redevelopment, which is adding a lot of new potential units to Scarborough. But I'm not asking you necessarily to be an expert on the surrounding areas, but certainly there are other around Portland cities that are much have much more sort of stringent requirements. We're seeing sort of barriers to affordable housing. Would you say that you and your the planning board have sort of taken a pro-growth and pro-affordable housing position, and what specific types of land use ordinances have encouraged that? Or would you disagree with that characterization?
That's a good question. I think we're middle of the road. We do try to be middle of the road. I do serve on a council that is supportive of seeing the development of more affordable or workforce housing within the town. But I will tell you, and this goes back to my thoughts on money and bonding and incentives for developers. You know, I bring these forward and I will talk one-on-one with developers because I know a lot of them from my business, as well as a town council. And it's not that they don't want to do this or build this, it's they can't afford it right now. And they have a right to make a profit. I mean, they're not, out there giving away the store or, going to build things for nothing. And I get that. But I do think there needs to be some monetary incentive. And I probably didn't answer your question, Hannah, and I apologize, but.
Any other questions? Commissioner Levine.
Great, thanks. And it's really interesting to hear your perspective. You had mentioned an interest in additional funding, which I think is very reasonable and makes sense. How would you feel if the additional funding was potentially tied to incentives for communities to allow more multifamily housing or more housing in general? Is that a sort of, how do you feel about that sort of idea?
I think that would be great. I'd like to see anything like that. And as I said, this low income senior housing, we've had a number of developments be approved in Scarborough. One of them is just starting to be built. And I'm sorry, I wasn't able to grab the numbers before I came into the meeting, but we will have a number of units for seniors, and that's awesome. But there are other people who need housing too, but there's no incentive out there for the developers to do it. But if we could pattern something like what we have for that low income senior housing would be great.
Commissioner Arata, Representative Arata.
Either one works. Thank you. I was wondering if you think that you'd receive the same amount of pushback if you were to make zoning more liberal for 4-unit buildings, because they would be owner occupied, provide pride of ownership, as well as some housing for moderate income people. Do you think you'd have the same resistance to those types of really small developments?
Well, no, it's not that we don't allow for them. We do. And we do have something called growth zones within Scarborough. One thing about Scarborough that's very interesting is you can divide it by the turnpike pretty much. And east of the turnpike on the water side, you've got sewer and water. And on the west side, where I happen to live, is very rural with septic and wells. So we do have so-called high growth areas where we do allow like 4 units or more. But it's just a lot of pushback from citizens on some of that development.
Any additional questions for the counselor? Any questions from folks on commissioners participating over Zoom? Don't see any hands raised. Great. Counselor, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thanks.
I will next turn it over to the mayor from Auburn, Mayor Levesque.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, commissioners and representatives. So let me, it was really, first of all, I got to tell you, the questions I just heard were great because it kind of flows into my presentation, which I prepared based upon our history. First, I want to say that we've been dealing with this for the last 3 years, and it kind of starts back when I became mayor in 2017. We had 3 affordable housing units that were state subsidized approved in the same year, which is fairly rare. It generated over 135 affordable housing units, nowhere near enough of the supply which we needed to kind of hit some of our growth goals. So we started a very comprehensive plan, very aggressive plan to look at different ways to add more housing. One of the ways we did that is really by changing the definition from affordable or market rate to attainable. And that's important for us because we believe that there's affordable housing all up and down the spectrum, depending upon which phase of your life you're in, family size, income levels, and so forth, and they all work holistically together. So by focusing on attainable housing and really looking at the market and what we had for assets, we have had built or approval or under construction a total in the last 3 years of 340 market rate or attainable apartments. So we think that's been a huge win for Auburn. In addition to that, over 90 single family homes have been built. So whereas we're seeing a lot of positive, we're also seeing that we're not really putting much of a dent in the problem. Though I will say our average attainable apartment or market rate apartment in Auburn for a 2-bedroom is running $1,400 to $1,500 a month. If you're coming from the greater Portland market, that's extremely affordable. So we've seen a lot of folks coming from Cumberland County, doing the 40-minute commute up the Turnpike and residing in Auburn. So it is really, it kind of told us that this is a true regional issue, and I'm glad the state is picking this up. So we've seen some growth. What else are we doing in order to see some significant growth? Let me just go through a quick list of actions that we've already done. Hopefully they can provide some stimulus or ideas for you all and other municipalities as you go through this process. First, we eliminated commercial parking requirements. Instead of the city dictating how much asphalt a commercial property, including a commercial residential property, needs, we'll let the builder or developer dictate that. What we've seen around the country when that happens is less asphalt, more land for building, whether it be commercial or residential, providing more infill, higher valuation, and more housing opportunities. It's still early though. We just did this earlier this year, so we haven't seen anything come from it yet, but we'll keep everybody posted as it starts being promoted more. We've already passed our secondary dwelling unit legislation in Auburn, or code, with no restrictions on size or placement or usage. We've had about a half a dozen serious inquiries on that. We expect those to be built throughout every residential zone of the city, not segregated. We've also waived all building and rehabilitation fees for veterans within the city, regardless of size or use, trying to help people rehab older units, bring them up to code, and making sure that they know that permitting fees are not going to be a hindrance. We've also eliminated exclusive zoning throughout the city that segregate multi-unit buildings into one area. So we firmly believe that you should have and should be able to have single-family homes co-located with 2 or 3 unit buildings in the same neighborhood and not in separate neighborhoods. What we're letting, where we let the zoning dictate the density versus the type of unit. Residential is residential, and that's how we feel in Auburn. We also have what we call a 3-bird, 1-stone strategy. And this, Representative Arada, you just mentioned this. We are putting together some programs right now to encourage owner-occupied 2, 3, and 4 unit buildings. This really kind of addresses the missing middle within housing, and A, provides more housing. B, it provides that leg up and that pathway out of poverty for these owners as well as the tenants, and providing more stock. So really, 3 birds, 1 stone. We have infill needs. We want to increase value downtown in the walkability market. This will all help with that. Combination with eliminating parking requirements, you'll actually keep land cost lower and more attainable and keep the overall construction cost down. Several other things we've done now is really focusing on artificial scarcity. These are all work in progresses, by the way. We are in the middle of we're almost done. It's up for review by state, as well as the city council adoption in the next couple of months, which is a brand new comprehensive plan. This comprehensive plan, we actually utilize George Mason University and some land use experts from the Mercatus Institute to help us look at best practices throughout the country in order to draft some of this. We obviously looked at some past comp plans in Maine, as well as the state comp plan guidelines, if you would, from 2002. And I'm going to talk about that in a second, in order to get some idea of what we needed to do to really eliminate artificial scarcity. Now, I'm going to be quite frank and honest. There's artificial scarcity. Most of the problems that we have in the state, they come from the local level. And from my research, and they're coming from really the 1960s and 70s, when zoning became very, very popular. And people started realizing that they could affect cultural change and economic change by having more restrictive zoning. Auburn had, and still does, over 35 different residential zones. These zones actually, in certain areas, force an income standard before you can build a residence on it. For example, our agricultural land, which is 40% of the size of Auburn, 20,000 acres, larger than the entire city of Portland. You cannot build a home on this land unless 30% of your income is generated from agriculture. This doesn't exist, from what we can tell, anywhere else in the country. Now, it's not there to protect agriculture because we have less ag land now than what we did in 1964 when it was implemented, and it's all turned into forest. It's not conducive to start up for ag, and it's not conducive to a residential building. And again, we're in a city. So we've seen these exclusive ordinances and zones be used to A, keep people out, B, decrease valuation within the city in order to shift taxes and tax burden upon those in downtown. Because if you make your land unbuildable, undevelopable, the value is naturally lower. So hence you pay lower or you pay less. Now, here's a conundrum that we found, though, as we were trying to fix this and do what I call tax normalcy, fairness across the city in like zones, i.e. if it's a residential zone, it's a residential zone. Just because it's grandfathered in an agricultural zone shouldn't mean that their value on a per acre is only $800 versus someone in a residential zone at $20,000 per acre. So we have this disconnect. But they've also used zoning and, frankly, information from the state to justify this. I'll give you one example. In 2002, the State Comprehensive Planning Guideline, and I'll give this to you, and you might have already seen this already, but it basically says there's an economic disadvantage to any residential growth, that on a dollar for dollar basis, for every dollar that a residential taxpayer pays in to the city, it costs the city $1.15. But with agriculture, there's actually a 64-cent profit, if you would, by the municipality for every acre of ag land. We cannot find substantiation for this anywhere. We've looked throughout the country, throughout the state. We have been told by state employees that trees don't have kids, keep your land protected, do not develop houses. So we're trying to solve an issue that I believe municipalities, and probably to a lesser degree the state, has caused in a way. But we're also probably not addressing the foundational problem, or I think the inaccuracies that are being portrayed out there, that, trees are good, kids are bad, kids cost money because you have to pay for school, and then trees don't. And that flows all the way into our rev share kind of component from the state. So I've heard thousands of times in Auburn that we cannot build any more homes or have any more value, because if we add value, we get less money from the state of Maine in rev share. And it's actually true. So that's actually a demotivating factor for not building any more new residences. We can't TIF a single family home. We can't TIF an owner occupied duplex or threeplex or fourplex. We can TIF some large apartment blocks, yes. And we have in the past, and that kind of makes sense. But you're not going to get large apartment blocks on the outside of the city or to fill in as infill into current sprawl. So that's some of our issues. We are actively solving it, we hope. If the comp plan gets approved, some of our density and some of our zones, well, first of all, our zones will go from 32 to 8. So we're making it simpler, easier to understand, and more giving people more the ability to grow if they want. But also the density, goes from 2 units to 8 units per acre in some zones, and from 4 units per acre to 16 units per acre. We also get rid of kind of this archaic road frontage rule and talk about depth and boundaries and density, so as you can have more flexibility within this parcel of land. Helps eliminate, again, or minimize artificial scarcity with regards to land. So that's kind of what we're doing right now. It's a work in progress. I know I probably threw a lot at you. I do have this typed up. I want to edit it and get it out to you as well. There's also some other suggestions, if I could make, things that we've seen from the development community and residents alike that probably could be solved. One is really looking at how we fund those 2, 3, and 4 units, those missing middle owner occupied units. I'd like to see, if possible, whatever the formula is, and I'll use just $30,000 as an example. Let's call it $30,000 per unit in a 2, 3, or 4 that's sold to someone with an income that does not exceed 100% of the average, whatever the formula is there, okay? That cash up front can be used for down payments. It can be used towards offsetting high construction cost. But when you're looking at, let's say it's $30,000, that's a $90,000 investment in a 3 unit, but $90,000 in state subsidy to acquire 3 new units of affordable housing might be a good way to spend that money, might be a good return on investment. Really looking at education on our municipalities, on really what the best practices are with regards to symbiotic relationships between agricultural operations and residential populations. I just got back from Virginia last week, huge agricultural area, and they had residences and ag all coexisting in harmony. And they had their front yards planted with soybean or corn. And they had a very vibrant agricultural community and a very vibrant local food community as well, or movement. So I'm seeing these things, and I see this is what we talk about, but there's that disconnect. We want to put ag away. We want to protect it, but protect it from what? And maybe we need to rethink some of those thought processes that we've had. Looking at revenue share and requirements, and having a bonus put into the municipal rev share for certain things. And this has been mentioned a little bit before, but maybe we're only going to count 50% of new home construction or affordable construction revenue towards your overall valuation of a municipality, maybe limiting the negative financial detriment to municipalities based upon growth. In general, Auburn has no caps on growth. We have no impact fees. We have eliminated 50% of all normal permitting fees. We are welcoming. We are getting the growth. It's happening, and we want more of it. So I think we're going to be very successful. But it is a regional problem and regional solutions. And I think with that said, I'll open it up for some questions. But we're right in this with you, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Mayor Levesque, for your presentation. Very informative and frankly, good to see some of the work and initiatives that you have taken and the city of Auburn has taken. Any questions from the commission? Commissioner Pingree.
Thank you. Good to see you, Mayor. I think it is, I totally agree with the speaker. It's exciting to hear all that's happening. I'm wondering if you could just reflect a little bit more on the conditions that sort of have prompted these changes. Where is the leadership coming from, and sort of how are the citizens engaged in the process? So that's question number one. And then I'd love for you to just talk a little bit more, your mention of regional, if how Auburn is thinking about that, particularly on the issue of housing.
Yeah, no, I will. Thank you. First of all, when I became mayor, it was 2017. I was elected 2018 and sworn in. That's after we had 3 pretty sizable state-funded affordable housing units approved and under construction. We knew that the demand was growing. We could either do one of 2 things, and this is kind of my driving policy when after I was sworn in. We could either wait and wait and wait, and hopefully a project would come and would be approved, or we could just say, we're going full speed ahead. We got to think of a different way. And that's what we did. Was it easy? No. Are there a lot of people in Auburn that won't speak to me anymore? Yeah, there are. And that's okay, because I'm not a very friendly person anyways, so it makes sense. but it's been pretty brutal. And what I found is during this whole process, I'm learning something over and over, that folks don't want change. They are looking for every justification not to have change. They don't understand the economic, social implications of growth and how it's important and how we need growth. And Maine is, as we all know, not or hasn't been, but it seems like we are now, which is great. But it's been brutal. But it really comes down to this. It comes down to money. It is very clear. And people hide behind emotional context in order to save personal tax dollars. They will hide behind saving the environment, saving agriculture in order to not pay more in taxes. It's a false perception, by the way. And that's why we need to educate folks. But again, the 2002 Maine State Comprehensive Plan urges you not to build houses. It gives you a financial argument not to do so. I've had that thrown at me so many times. And by the way, there is no substantiation for those claims. We can't find them. Nobody can. We don't know where this study came from, what it was based on, or even if it's applicable to Maine. So that's, to answer your question, Hannah, it's been really complicated. It's been brutal at times, but we're moving forward. People are realizing it. The more we have these conversations at the state and regional level, the more they're understanding that. And also I think saying no is the biggest enemy of good, smart progress. And we see that all the time. Now, regionally, we're 35 minutes from Portland. The fact that Greater Portland ends at the Cumberland County line is nonsensical. I have been working with actually Greater Portland Council of Governments, mayors, municipal leaders around Southern Maine and Central Maine, because we all are part of the same economy. We're part of the same community. And we need to make sure that we're supporting each other in what we're doing, whether it's economic growth in the Rue Institute in Portland or a new recently announced 128 unit apartment complex that's being built by an out-of-state developer, by the way, first time in Maine ever, in Auburn. So we're seeing some really big growth here, but we all have to work together.
Additional questions from the commission? I see Commissioner Kupenreiter, sorry.
Congratulations, Mr. Mayor. It sounds like the city of Auburn has done some really important work, and we definitely have some good points of reference from the work your town has done. I have 3 questions for you, and I'll give you, I think, the easiest one first. You mentioned that you had eliminated commercial parking requirements. What, if anything, have you done on the residential parking side?
I fought the residential one. That was a tough one. I got it approved for commercial residences, 4 units or more. I couldn't get it done for anything lower than that. It just took effect a couple months ago, so we don't have any traction there at this point. Though we are building a new Target downtown, I think we might get some more pad development commercial sites there, which all helps, maybe not directly, but indirectly.
My second question has to do with the single family, multifamily distinction. So congratulations for eliminating that. That's a really big impediment in almost every community in Maine for development of multifamily housing. Do you have specific minimum lot size requirements or minimum lot area per dwelling unit requirements in those zones?
We do. We have shifted most of our downtown, including our general business zones, towards a form-based code. So we're looking at just really side front setbacks, which are extremely minimum. Once a comp plan is approved and the ordinances are written and adopted, our density really throughout, I'd say 50% of our city doubles, if not triples. So it's really going to be a density move or units per acreage in areas that are served with water and sewer, which is a good portion of our city.
And last question has to do with the definition of attainable housing. I think you said that it's market rate housing. So meaning no state or federal subsidy.
Correct.
Okay. So it's created entirely by a market resource.
Yeah. All the 240 units I discussed, in addition to the 80 homes in the last 3 years built, have been all market rate. Now, some of them have had TIFs, small TIFs, so we can enhance or expand sidewalks, water, sewer infrastructure, which is normal and good. But we call them attainable because today's luxury apartments per se are tomorrow's affordable. And through the theory of displacement, And if we weren't a regional community, if we were just Auburn, we would have been able to open up supply, minimize demand, and hence lower rates across the entire spectrum of apartments, making things more affordable or more attainable, regardless of income category. But what we're doing is, as soon as we're building them, we're getting people from Portland and Scarborough actually moving to Auburn. So it's not making a big enough dent. You know, we're helping southern Maine towns and cities with their problem, sort of, but we're taking population away, which probably isn't a great thing. Maybe it is. So yeah, but it is, long story short, it is all market rate.
So one last clarifying question. You mentioned rates of $1,400 to $1,500 a month. Is that for a one bedroom?
2.
Thank you. And congratulations on your good work.
Thank you.
I see Commissioner Topman has his hand raised.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mayor. My question is very similar to Aaron's. I want to make sure I heard you right on the parking. Did you say anything that is 4 units or more, or more than 4 units has no parking requirement? Is that correct?
Correct. As long as it falls under that commercial definition, according to banks, right? 4 units or more. Yes.
So I guess just to push a little bit more there, can you help us understand what is that commercial definition? That's part A to my question. And part B to my question is, could you sort of characterize the debate that occurred around the parking reduction here, which I wholeheartedly support. I think it's great. But if you could just sort of explain to us, how did that go down? What was the conversation like, the debate like, the final vote like around that parking piece? And again, is there anything particularly unique about the commercial definition?
Yeah, the commercial definition is any retail or commercial application plus residential units numbering 4 units or greater.
So if I could, if there is only residential and no commercial aspect, would it therefore not be commercial?
No, if it was residential with 4 units or more,
Okay.
then, and it was solely, if it was a commercial or multi-use, commercial first floor units above, absolutely no parking requirements. If it was a straight residential usage of 4 units or more, no parking requirements.
Thank you.
Now, the debate was interesting. It didn't last very long because you have to apply pragmatic ways of thinking. If someone is in the privacy market and they want a house with an acre of land, they're going to have it 50 feet back. They're going to build a driveway. They're going to have parking. That's what it is. But if you're downtown, for every 2 parking spots you have, that's literally 1 unit of additional housing that can be built at a single story. Obviously, you're going up, it's more. And I made the case of this. I go, okay, you want a walkable downtown and city, you want public transportation, and you want parking everywhere for everyone. You can't have it. Pick 2. What 2 do you want? You want buses and sidewalks? Great, get rid of parking. You want parking and sidewalks? Great, get rid of buses. Pick 2. That's it. I thought 2 was pretty generous. So once we made that, everybody started thinking about which one they wanted to get rid of. Parking was an easy choice.
And the vote?
7-0 or 6-1, 6-1.
Thank you.
Commissioner Spalding.
Mayor Levesque, thank you so much for your presentation. I agree. It's very, very impressive, all the accomplishments that you've had. I just wanted to maybe get a little bit more of your thinking on the food and agriculture dynamics that you're faced with. I work for Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, and my role as a commissioner on this commission is to get information about affordable housing for the farm labor community. Labor is just a really critical challenge for agriculture in Maine. We are obviously very concerned about farming sustainably and protecting the environment and farmland protection. We know that 400,000 acres or more is going to change hands in the next decade and potentially could be lost to agricultural production in general. And we also are dependent on food imports. More than 92% of the food that we consume here in Maine comes from away, and it needn't be so. And so I guess I just wonder, I don't mean to sound defensive, I'm just very curious to know, when you talk about people hiding behind environmental and farmland protection, do you see a path forward to including, looking out for environmental protection and farmland protection, and providing housing for the absolutely critical ag labor?
Absolutely.
Of course.
I'm glad you brought it up. Let me explain. Our really restrictive ag zoning went into effect in 1964. Since 1964, we've had an 80% decrease in active farmers. We went from 70% of our land being actively farmed to today, only about 4%. 73% is forested. It's reverted away from agriculture. Why? Because farmers historically need to live and want to live for economic or practical reasons within the farm that they are managing and using. That's their startup. You can't do that in Auburn unless 30% of your income is derived from agriculture. That's your family's income. That means if you want to be a farmer and your husband's a teacher, okay, that means automatically $20,000 to $25,000 of your annual income needs to be derived from agriculture year one. Unattainable. It was 50% until I fought tooth and nail based upon studies done by national firms to get that to 30%. We want people to farm. We want people to clear the land. We have grants to help them clear forest and produce agriculture and actually conduct ag. But nobody wants to do it because they can't live there. They maybe in 4 or 5 years could meet that threshold, but today they can't. Okay, not on day one, week one. So yes, it needs to happen. We need to have more land, but we also need to recognize that the people that are more vested in locally produced organic crops are the ones that live around there, that work on the farms, that visit the farms, that want to buy and shop local. The more local we have, the cheaper the prices become, right? And if you can cut costs by living on the land that you till or raise crops or animals on, you're going to be more successful. So I would love your help. I would love to be able to get farmers to come back to Auburn. Again, we have more land tied up in agriculture than Portland has land. What would that do? And I'll give you this one. There's a lot of farms in New Hampshire. New Hampshire has 4 times the density that Maine does. If Auburn had New Hampshire's density levels, we'd have around 80,000 people in Auburn. Currently, Auburn geographically is larger than Portland, South Portland, Westbrook, and Cape Elizabeth combined. Geographically, and together, those 4 communities have well over 110,000 people. We have the space, okay? And I'm not advocating for Auburn to be at 80,000, residents, but just to illustrate that we have the space for agriculture and residential use to cohabitate together. They shouldn't be separate. They don't need to have those lines drawn. Auburn folks are so used to being able to use that ag land to keep the value low because nobody will buy or do anything with the land, which hence, because of how Maine does their land valuations for tax purposes, keeps their personal property taxes low. We have to deconstruct it.
Additional questions for the mayor? Commissioner Levine.
Thanks, and thanks for the comprehensive overview of all the things that are going on in Auburn. I wanted to circle back to your talk about state aid and some of the ideas you had for using it as an incentive for additional housing production. Can you talk about those a little more?
Yeah, I'd love to. This is something that I think is, first of all, you've alluded to it before. It's a huge part of the missing middle. We have infill potential within our urban areas that are serviced through existing utilities. It's cost effective. They can fit a 2, 3, 4 unit building in these infill areas. The problem is we have a lack of construction workers. Okay, they're busy. They're everywhere. Costs are going up. And if I'm a developer, maybe Mr. Napolitano can speak on this later. If I'm a developer, I'm going to go after the 40 unit building. I'm not going to go after a 4. It just makes better sense. Margins are better. So, by taking some and shifting these resources, and let me be clear, I think we can solve a lot of our problem here without allocating any more state or federal dollars. I don't think we need more money. I think we just need to use it differently. And we need to make sure these municipalities modify their zones. So, last stat I saw pre-pandemic was around, $120,000 to $130,000 per unit in a 3-unit building, moderate, 900 square feet each. If we could apply $20,000 or $30,000 to each one of those units, then that becomes more affordable to build. And we can income restrict those units' rents and the owner occupied as well in order to keep them affordable for a period of time, whatever that might be. That's one thing. I also think that when you're looking at these 30 and 40 unit properties, maybe instead of building 30 or 40 units of subsidized housing with 5 or 6 units as market rate, why don't we flip it? Why don't we incentivize the developer to build 40 units of, market rate and 10 units, so for a 50-unit building, and 10 units of affordable. That way, we're not just grouping people of lower income in one area, in one building. We're actually spreading this out a little bit and getting a net gain, because those folks in affordable are going to be leaving another apartment that can be backfilled by someone else. We're increasing the stock. If we increase the stock however way we can with our limited finances, it's going to keep these market pressures down and provide affordable or attainable housing for all.
Any additional questions? Commissioner Golick.
You were just speaking, and forgive me, I'm hearing impaired, so I want to make sure that I got some of it right, of building units mixed with like market-based and income-based housing. So otherwise a percentage of vouchers would be approved in those things. Thank you very much for mentioning that.
Yep.
I totally agree with that. I think that's something that we need to, as a whole state, look more at, offering incentives to builders and landlords to create affordable housing units that are mixed. We open up the market much better with that. Would you apply this just to newer model units, or do you see this as an incentive to landlords that are already out there that own units, that if they say, if you were to give them something as an incentive to say, okay, you got 240 units and can you make 10% of them income based?
Yeah, I wouldn't. We need a net gain, in my opinion. We need a net gain. And we need it relatively quickly. But if we focus on building newer, I mean, Maine has, I believe, the oldest housing stock in the country. We're putting a lot of money, our federal CDBG and home funds, and we just got a grant in Auburn for lead abatement. So we're putting millions of dollars into rehabbing older stock, which is important. One of the best things we can do to help rehab older stock is to build new units. Okay, that's going to be a multiplier, or if you would, an incentive for a lot of these units to come and be modernized and keep the rents affordable. At the same time, we do have to fix lead poisoning. It's a huge issue. I don't want to convolute the two, but they do go hand in hand. I personally think that new is the way to go at this point.
Commissioner Jackson has his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you for the full picture that you've given, Mayor. My hand's been up for a while, so you probably addressed some of this stuff that has been going. My also concern was with the difference between affordable and attainable. Attainable seems like more market rate, and that brings to me is like the growth that you talk about. Who is that actually? What's the demographic that actually is getting that growth? Because from my personal experience, people who are really low income can't really make that 40-minute drive from Portland to go to Auburn and, get those newly available or attainable apartments. So what is the demographic that is getting the growth with the things that you have implemented, and how much pushback are you getting for the things that, would create more affordable housing?
So we use the term attainable because, unfortunately, I think affordable and market rate have been used so much and for two totally different things that the true definitions are spoiled. Affordable now is low income. That's it. When you say affordable housing, you mean state subsidized housing, it's low income, that's it. No, I'm not saying that's right. That's perception. Then when you say market rate, you're thinking about $1 million homes in Scarborough or Cape Elizabeth or high-end luxury apartments in the Old Port. That's not true. Okay, not true at all. I had a friend of mine here in Auburn actually just built several 3-bedroom, 2-bath ranches and sold them for $160,000 to $190,000 each. That mortgage is cheaper, much cheaper than a quote unquote affordable apartment on a monthly basis. That's an attainable home. So we wanted to use a term that would make people think about the differences between affordable and market rate and how something that's attainable for all income levels. That's one of the reasons we're using that term. Now, to answer your question about the demographics, you're absolutely right. Someone making $12.50 an hour in Portland is not going to be able to afford the commute from Auburn to Portland. They can't. Okay. But what they are doing and what we are seeing is those individuals are leaving those $12.50 or $13 or $14 hour jobs in Portland and getting the same job at the same wage in Auburn, but with half the cost of living. That's not going to be good for Portland. So, and that's where the competition that we want to try to probably avoid is happening. So we're seeing people literally pick up and move and change jobs and move up here. But what we are seeing too, besides that, we are seeing a lot of young professionals, a lot of teachers, a lot of recent grads or students that are going, in our case, Central Maine Community College, nurses living in Auburn, commuting to Portland, or working in Auburn and Lewiston. We're also seeing a lot of retirees, active retirees and snowbirds. They're living in Florida 6 months in a day, but they keep this apartment kind of locked up for 12 months. They love it. They want to be around their families. They come up here in the summer. They're staying in an apartment for $1,300 a month. Makes sense. That's what we're seeing.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just since this is a commission on affordable housing and the people who are mostly impacted by this lack of housing are low income and Black and Indigenous and Brown people. So I hope that we can really hear more about what are the hurdles for these people and why are we getting these housing for lower income and why we do that.
It's the simplest. It is supply. We don't have enough. It's supply. If you ask folks about, you talk about a lower income demographic, I'll talk about it, attainable organic produce. You can't afford it because there's not enough supply there. There's pretty significant demand as well as there should be. And prices are through the roof. It's hard to buy organic cucumbers, though. God, I love them. Same thing with housing.
How's it going with that artificial scarcity movement?
Oh, I'm getting pushback. When someone says, and I'll be honest here, it's recorded. Well, I don't care. When people say we want to maintain the rural character or the character of our neighborhood, that's all coming from the 1930s and redlining. All this stuff is foundationally based on racist zoning principles. We're trying to eliminate it, but it's just prevalent everywhere. Now, it wasn't African Americans in the 1930s or 40s. It was French Canadians like Levesque. They did not want to leave New Auburn and move out to West Auburn. It took 3 generations for this French Canadian guy to buy a house in West Auburn where all the other white people live. It's great. Love it. So, that's how it is. And then it's morphed. And so, yeah, zoning is the biggest detriment we have right now to racial equity with regards to affordable and fair housing. As I said it, people don't like it when I do. And I think the counselor from Scarborough can attest to that.
Any additional questions for the mayor? Senator Hickman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mayor, for your presentation and for answering all of these great questions from our commissioners. I appreciate absolutely your last remark. That will be the topic of our commission meeting next week. And we expect that to be robust and go for a minute. I do want to disavow you of one thing, though. I am an organic farmer, and I don't know if you've been to the grocery store lately, but conventional peppers are $6.99 a pound at the grocery store from Ecuador. I don't charge anywhere near that for mine. So I just wanted to say that the price of organic vegetables on roadside farm stands is absolutely able to compete or even do better with what's going on at the grocery store, given that the price of food is through the roof.
Is that because we got more? So, I mean, send me a message. I want to know because I like organic peppers. I think I know where your farm is. So let me know this because I want to know why. Are we making more of them or is it just as a transportation cost, what have you? But I think that, besides that, take the concept of supply and demand towards housing, I think is.
Oh, absolutely. I'm being a little, if you saw me in person, I'd be smiling. I think a lot of it just has to do with we import food and the food supplies across the country have declined, especially during COVID. And so the price of all sorts of things has gone up.
I will say your fight and your commission fight on the racist foundations of zoning, feel free to reach out to the Mercatus Institute at George Mason. I can provide you with their contact information as well. Dr. Salem Firth, who's actually originally from Eastport, Maine, is a national leader in zoning equity. And we've talked extensively about this. This is the biggest thing we can do is to get rid of these really just exclusive zoning practices that are all over municipalities, all over the state.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Any additional questions? Before we let you go, Mr. Mayor, the only question I would pose is, well, I guess it's going to be a comment, and I'll ask for your response. But I mean, clearly one of the challenges that we have from the state at the state level is something you're probably very familiar with, which is home rule. We have take a lot of pride here in the state regarding local control. And I think what we're going to learn through today's conversation, and I think we're already seeing it. We had a presentation from a counselor in Scarborough, and now a presentation from the mayor of Auburn. And what I've gathered is two very different things are happening. In one town, you have a cap on how many houses can be built. And then we have another town that is really moving forward and taking the lead on how to address, in my opinion, zoning that is an impediment to the construction of housing, which also then leads to the lack of affordability. So how do you think we, sitting here on a panel, a commission that has been authorized by the legislature at the state level, how can we address this challenge that is a statewide issue, but ultimately, most of the time, the authority rests with the 500 various municipalities throughout the state?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, Senator, or Representative, or Speaker, I should say. Education and incentify. Home rule is critical. It is. I mean, we don't like to be told what to do by Augusta. We get that. We're Mainers. But we do think the education is critical. Look at your own house first, literally and figuratively. Look at all the different departments within the state of Maine. Look at those discrepancies. Look at the the comprehensive planning guideline from the state from 2002. Look at how the anomalies there are being used to really move against what your goals are. So look inside, make sure everything's cleaned up with a unified message going forward. Second, incentivize. Don't penalize or change things so we're not penalized for adding value with regards to residences. I think that's critical. Let's take that off the table because it's counterproductive. The more homes we build, the less rev share we get or the less school funding we receive. I'm not sure if that makes sense. Again, it's an impediment for us to convince our constituents that growth is good. And then incentivize, okay? Open up more grants for sewer and water expansion, specifically for infill and to prevent sprawl. And recognize that we're regional. Auburn, I hear it all the time. We have these restrictive zoning so we can prevent sprawl. What happened? Auburn's population hasn't increased since 1965. But Poland, Minot, Turner, outlying towns, their populations have doubled and they have 5-acre minimum lot sizes. We've actually stepped in a puddle. The water never went away. It just spread out. And we've actually created more carbon. We've created more sprawl. We've created more infrastructure issues in wear and tear on our highways. So let's keep that. Let's redefine things, incentivize municipalities to do the right thing. You'll find in a very short order, municipalities are going to get on board relatively quickly.
Thank you. Very, very helpful direction, I think, for the work that we have before us. My only final question is, what is the ordinance around parking for residential in Auburn?
It's right now, it's 1.5. Oh, 1.5 spaces for every unit. And it's 0.75 for senior housing. So it's archaic. It really is. It's something I don't think we should be looking at, but it's probably similar to that in most other municipalities too, but it's something that should be fixed.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Appreciate all of your insight. Any final questions for the mayor? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate you being here.
No, thank you all.
We now have a presentation from Andrea Powers, town manager in Fort Fearfield. I think we'll get a different perspective, or maybe not. We'll see. Different part of the state, that's for sure. Thank you for being here, Ms. Powers.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to leave shortly after my presentation to pick up my youngest daughter, but I can return if that's okay.
Okay, great.
Good afternoon, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the commission. I am Andrea Powers, the town manager in Fort Fairfield, which is located in central Aroostook County. For those of you that don't know, Maine Potato Blossom Festival, most of you know us as. I do want to thank you all for allowing me the opportunity to share with you my thoughts and concerns on these issues with the commission on LD 609. I am listening. I'm in this working group as well and listening to everyone. And we are very different. Our discussions are not the same as yours. And I have a series of questions I would like the commission to consider when you are making these decisions here. More importantly, what is your definition of a housing crisis or housing shortage as it's referred to in LD 609? Can you clearly define what that means for the entire state? I find that it's very different for every community, even just our neighboring communities that are very close to us. Housing difficulties are not the same for the entire state of Maine. The commission will be making decisions for all municipalities based on what? Exclusive zoning ordinances. Where is the data that will be used to make these decisions on increasing housing opportunities in Maine by studying zoning and land use restrictions? Is the topic of discussion really fair market value concerns? Is it aging in place concerns? Or is it the zoning and land use restrictions? How many of you have asked questions of the municipal employees with boots on the ground, so to speak, that are implementing these restrictions, if you will, such as your local code enforcement officer? How will your decisions as a commission affect their ability to do their jobs on the municipality that they work for? One of my greatest concerns is the aging out of CEOs across the state. Code enforcement, not typically perceived as a glamorous job, does not seem to be attracting young up-and-coming citizens of the state. I have several discussions with my CEO daily about how the new statutes could affect his ability to do his job, and certainly how proposed legislation would affect his ability to implement any of those changes. Is the property decent, safe, and sanitary? That's what we live by here. These are the questions that need to be answered and applied to rules and regulation and code enforcement. Does this possible new legislation defeat this purpose? What about shoreline zoning and wastewater rules? Really, it's about science. The minimum size in order to facilitate proper evaporation. Zoning protects neighborhoods and districts. If the discussion at the state level is about someone feeling they are unfairly burdened in this, is it political or is it necessary? And I think those are questions we need to start discussing. Where is the housing crisis in the terms of your definition of housing crisis? What do you mean by a housing crisis? Because for instance, here in Fort Fairfield, our housing crisis is the condition of properties. We have old farmhouses that have been vacant for years that need funding for either removal or repairs versus what I've seen in southern and coastal Maine, where they have literally no space for any more housing. How do you determine what the housing crisis for each municipality is and who's more at risk? How about the teacher with a starting salary that has to travel 50 miles to their job or 40 miles because they're priced out of the community that they work in? those that need services provided by the community that they're priced out of, or changes to the zoning and land use restrictions that allow for a large corporation to build out, say, Munson Pond here in Fort Fairfield, effectively depleting our natural resources and heritage from a beloved area of our community, based on decisions that will be made by the commission on any changes to the zoning restrictions and land use restrictions. These seem like more important issues than MUBEC or state policies that are out of control of the municipality. Home rule authority, changing that seems to bring conditions that are unsafe with no oversight. Mr. Speaker, as you made mention to, Southern Maine, Northern Maine, Central Maine, Western Maine, we are all the same, yet we are not. In researching this, I found that the national focus on planning, and therefore the state focus on planning, has drastically changed over the last 15 years or so. There were approximately 800 planners across the state that focused on comprehensive planning that now all work for various other agencies. And is this the decline in interest in code enforcement? I really don't know. However, I think it bears further discussion. As I read the legislative document for LD 609, I noticed the communities listed for the presenter, the co-sponsor, and the representatives: Biddeford, Sagadahoc, Wodenham, Vassalboro, Portland, South Portland, Boothbay, Scarborough, and Camden. We're pretty far away from all of that and far removed from what you are finding for your housing crisis. We all have a part in solutions to the issues in our state, and part of that comes from remembering that our state is beautifully diversified and each community has its pros and cons, and that is what attracts citizens to those communities. I don't really have to tell you that because I think everybody really understands that, but I think it bears saying. Those same municipalities cannot be continuously relied upon to resolve issues without resources and funding. And I agree change is needed, and I fear addressing blame on municipalities will set us up for failure. Expecting the municipalities to resolve a statewide problem without resources and funding will most definitely set us up for failure. Unfunded mandates are very difficult, and especially in these times. We are willing to work with the legislature, and we really want to because we live here as well. I would implore the commission to remember that the needs are vast and resources and funding is few and far between. I would ask the ladies and gentlemen of the commission to please keep these questions and thoughts in mind when making decisions that represent the entire state in zoning and land use restrictions and moving forward on LD 609. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Powers. And do you have time to take questions or do you need to depart?
Nope, I can take a few questions for sure.
Any questions from the commission? I guess I would start by just asking, what is the state of housing in Fort Fearfield? What are people unable to find housing? Are they easily able to find housing? What are some of the, like, what's the word on the street, if you will?
So we've had a lot of families with young families move to Fort Fairfield recently over the last year. Last winter was not a good indication of what winter life will be like here. So I'm concerned for some of our newest citizens for this winter coming up, but we'll see what happens. We have, again, mostly old farmhouses, dilapidated old farmhouses that are airship properties, if you will, that really need help in better establishing more single family units for our citizens moving here. We have several apartment units as well. We also have our housing authority here. So there are lots of apartment units already in Fort Fairfield. And I think a lot of the concern that we're hearing from the citizens of our area is that changes in zoning and land use across the state could make it very easy for a large developer to come in here and build large housing units that would be successful in southern Maine, coastal Maine, maybe even in central Maine, but here would deplete the land use that we already have established agriculturally. And that is a big concern for a lot of our citizens. The affordable housing issue, I think for us more is sort of that concept of aging in place and having those discussions with our citizens about that and what that means for them. And how any decisions that are made by the legislature could affect their decisions and their abilities to be able to do that as well. We certainly have lots of space for folks that are interested in coming to the county for sure. And we would love to have you. But we would just love for the commission to keep in mind that our definition of a housing crisis, or however you want to term it, it is probably very different than what you're seeing down there. Does that answer your question, Mr. Speaker? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think that's definitely helpful. I guess just as a quick follow-up, is there are there rules around the ag land, like we just heard from the mayor in Auburn? So well, I guess you can answer that question. I guess what I'm thinking is part of the reason why those homes on agricultural land aren't being purchased and renovated or repaired, is it because there's a requirement that they are doing ag work on the land, or why do you think some of those properties have been left abandoned?
I think a lot of the farm families have aged out of their farms. The heirs of the farms just had no interest in running the farms, and so they've moved away and left the farms, family farms here, and therefore left the homes unattended.
And my final question, I don't want to consume the entire commission's time, but how much of the agricultural land in Fort Fairfield is currently in use versus out of use? And you mentioned a concern over agricultural land becoming housing. Does that concern
Not necessarily housing, but
Okay.
housing developments,
Okay.
apartment units that would, so, and this is a topic across the state of Maine, but we are very heavily tax-based, property tax-based in our municipalities. And how do we get away from that if we are seeing more and more of these units that are not, taxable single family units? So that is something that folks are concerned about.
So the concern amongst citizens in Fort Fairfield is not necessarily that ag land becomes housing, but rather what type of housing it becomes.
Yeah, if it impedes upon, what they need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions to the commission? Commissioner Hill.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It's certainly valued and a great perspective in a different region of our state. My question is, you said that you have recently had a significant amount of people moving to your town. Would you say that the supply and demand is fairly balanced for inventory in the real estate market? And also, would you say, can you assess the number of rental units compared to people who are in need of them? And then lastly, can you compare your town to some of your neighbors, and if you're on par with what you're seeing around your area?
Sure. Thank you for your question. I would say that we have housing available for the young families that have moved here. They've all purchased new homes, not renting. We do see an influx and a changeover. We do have a lot of Section 8 housing here in Fort Fairfield in the rental units. We have yet to see an issue, but that doesn't mean that won't change next week, next month, next year, given the citizens that have moved here to Fort Fairfield, and they're from all over. We have new families from New Mexico, Texas, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. So people who are very interested in this part of the state and this part of Aroostook County. We often don't know how they found us. Some of them say they came for festival and never wanted to leave. Some say they just put a pin on a map. So we don't feel that crunch like they're feeling in Southern Maine for having units available for new citizens to be in their communities. So our crunch is coming from how those decisions are going to affect what we do here in Aroostook County. And yes, we're all part of the state of Maine, and it's wonderful. But we do all have different, because we're in different regions, different areas of concern. And placing a definition on that for the entire state, I think is probably detrimental to what the commission is probably trying to do here. So.
Any additional questions from commissioners? Commissioner Brennan.
Ms. Powers, and I'm sorry if I didn't pick up on it with the question that was just asked, but the general sense is that the growth that you're experiencing or the influx, is it specific to Fort Fairfield, which, by the way, I think is one of the prettier towns in all of Maine. It's gorgeous. Is it unique to Fort Fairfield, or is it countywide?
So I would say countywide, we have seen a huge influx of families that have come to us from southern Aroostook County, central, all the way to northern Aroostook County. And I think that, again, it depends on the municipality, because our neighboring two cities, Caribou and Presque Isle, their issues are very different from ours here in Fort Fairfield. It is specific to your municipality, your region. So I can't speak to their, specific issues in the sense that, I have seen people have difficulties trying to find apartments or houses or anything, but it's not that it's difficult in the sense that, they can't just call up and say, hey, I'd like to take this apartment. Whereas before, I think landlords, when they would place an ad in the paper, it would be a while before they would have someone give them a call. Now it's pretty quick. You place an ad and it's not long before someone. So again, I think it's just rise in population, rise in interest of being here. But again, I wouldn't dare to say what their definition of a housing crisis would be for them.
Sure, that's very nice to hear. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Any additional questions? Just one more question from me, and I promise I'll quit. What are employers saying in your area? What are they hearing from people who are considering to work for them or are working for them? Are they having trouble finding housing in Fort Fairfield? What is
So we
that?
did have a farmer who recently just built a new apartment unit for their workers that came in, that come seasonally. And they just worked with code enforcement to get that done in the quickest and safest way possible for their staff. So.
And was that built on the property of the farm or?
On the farm, yes.
Yeah. And so was the zoning permissible at that from the beginning of the project, or was there a change made to permit such a project on the property?
No changes were made, and it was beginning from the very beginning of the project.
Okay, great. Thank you. Excellent. Any other questions before we let Ms. Powers go to the school pickup zone? Seeing none. Thank you, Ms. Powers, for being here. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Great. Next presenter is Christine Germando, Planning and Urban Development Department of Portland. Ms. Germando, thank you for being with us. Hopefully I pronounced your last name correctly.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Speaker Fecto, Senator Hickman, members of the commission. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and I have enjoyed listening to the presentation so far. I'm Director for Planning and Urban Development with the City of Portland. I've been with this department, with the city, since 2014, and originally joined as a senior planner. And for years, certainly since my arrival here, we have known and documented the need for more affordable housing, more supply of housing overall to meet the needs of current residents in the city and in the region, as well as for our own goals, for the city's own goals, for growth, for encouraging a population that can support a strong local economy and transit and complete neighborhoods. And we have built approximately 1,400 units of housing since mid-2017, and I peg it to that to the middle of a year because that's when we adopted our new comprehensive plan. So it was an important year for us as far as setting out some policy goals around growth and housing and how we thought it should unfold. But perhaps it goes without saying, housing affordability and supply issues They've only been exacerbated since the onset of the pandemic, despite us working real hard on housing creation. But the city has implemented a multifaceted suite of housing policies to both encourage new housing creation and require affordability. I'm just going to briefly tick off some of those policy initiatives. We have implemented changes in different parts of the city, not citywide, but for certain residential zones and in our business zones to allow for greater housing creation. And this included adjusting dimensional standards, things like lot sizes and heights and density calculation requirements. And that has been critical from a market rate housing creation perspective. Portland has inclusionary zoning requirements, requires that projects of 20 dwelling units or more provide a share of workforce housing, either through a developer building units on site or making contributions to the city's housing trust fund. We also have an inclusionary zoning requirement for new hotels that works much the same way, but pegged to a number of hotel rooms that mostly results in additional contributions to that housing trust. City recently adopted a new accessory dwelling unit ordinance, which made it substantially easier to create small incremental additions of new housing on residential properties. That was late last year. Affordable and workforce housing, depending on the degree and the amount of affordability, those projects are eligible for density and height bonuses in some zones, as well as permit fee reductions, and they get prioritized review by staff. We have housing replacement requirements that says removal of housing over a certain amount needs to either be recreated or again be offset with some contribution to that housing trust. Our city council, who has prioritized this issue, I will say, for years now and recognize how important it is. One of their approaches for city property when they're considering disposition of city property is to prioritize affordable housing on that property. We have a great deal of flexibility in our parking standards. We've had flexibility for years in different ways, and we went a little farther than that late last year and created more exemptions for proximity to bus routes and some other avenues to reducing minimum parking requirements for projects as well. I've mentioned contributions to our housing trust numerous times so far, and I will say that creating mechanisms to fund that trust has been one of our strongest tools to helping to finance affordable housing proposals. We also administer home, CDBG, housing tips, and a number of other programs that provide critical financial assistance to affordable housing creation. We are in the midst of what we call our Recode Initiative, and this is an evaluation and rewriting of our local regulations. And we're evaluating our codes for a number of things, but one of the primary goals of that is looking at barriers to housing, particularly through the lenses of sustainability, climate change, and equity, including evaluating the code for those lingering traces, lingering impacts of redlining that was mentioned earlier today and other discriminatory practices that originated in the 20th century and I think can still be kind of baked into many of our codes. And we're sort of combing through with an eye for that to see if we can do some correcting, of course, on our code as well. This Recode work builds directly on our 2017 comprehensive plan goals, which really has been a critical springboard for us doing this work. We still have a lot more to do on this topic. It is a central concern of ours, and we have a fairly large toolbox, but we continue to actively pursue better and more ways to do this work. And I would say some takeaways from our experience so far. One, there is not one tool, I think, that's going to be perfect or speak to all of our needs. It's just too large and multifaceted an issue. And so I think that sort of multiplicity of ways of addressing it's been really important and will continue to be. Another thing I'd say is that encouraging housing creation and diversity of housing types, including multifamily, it's as essential overall to our health and accessibility of our housing supply as dedicated, affordable, and workforce housing projects. Those are both really important aspects, I think, of what we do. But housing creation is critical, including market rate housing to housing affordability. I think our experience has shown that mixing both requirements and incentives continues to be important and to be has been pretty successful for housing supply and housing policy. And our city, like any community in the state, has its diversity in neighborhoods and scales and infrastructure and capacity and opinions. And having proposals that recognize those different contexts is really important, I think, and critical to our prospects for continuing to successfully implement change. And I guess that's my community engagement plug, that I think having an ongoing, robust community dialogue about the need for this change and why is so important for us to continue to be able to grow and to implement change. So lastly, I'll just say that as a member of MMA's working group, I have enjoyed speaking with my colleagues from across the state about our challenges in common and not in common and how we might work together. And I look forward to continuing this discussion, and I'm happy to be here. So thank you, and happy to take questions or talk some more.
Great. Thank you for your presentation as well. Any questions from the commission? Commissioner Pingree.
Thank you, and thanks for your presentation. I think we read about some of the other towns in the newspaper, but obviously Portland gets a lot of coverage, and specifically, obviously lots of discussion, Maine's largest city. I'm wondering specifically, because there was a lot of newspaper discussion about it, about the historic zones of Portland and their impact on affordable housing. Obviously, again, we've all read the debate, just wondering what you think the impact is. I have another question, but I'll try to keep it to one for now.
Sure, thanks for that. Yes, we recently implemented a new historic district. We have a number, I think that was our 12th, and it was a lively debate, to say the least. And a lot of that discussion was about the impact of preservation on housing costs, on gentrification, as well as the need to retain things people really love about this city as well. And so there was a range of opinions out there, and we took all those and we did our best to answer many of those questions. So in some ways, so their initial analysis showed that there was not a strong correlation between our historic districts and housing costs, but we acknowledge we did not have perfect data on that front. It also, it does limit the certain possibilities for new housing creation, no doubt. But it also, I think it's always really important to note, it doesn't our intent is never to freeze a location in place where it's density, new construction, additions, things like that. So your maximum you can do within a building envelope remains the same in a historic structure as outside of one. And we're pretty, we try to be pretty flexible about, again, new additions and sort of modifications of buildings too. But that said, you know, this is something I think has to be applied the places that sort of most demand it, because I think it does then tamp down the certain possibilities for new construction. That said, there are plenty of areas in the city with no historic districts that probably could handle more density as well. And so we tried to bring a layered approach that there is, preservation has been a valued and great tool in Portland. It should not be layered everywhere or indiscriminately. And I understand the passion people brought to that, and the fact that we have housing goals and we want to balance those things as well. But we've tried to write our preservation ordinance in a way that doesn't necessarily freeze housing in place as far as what can occur in a building or on a site. And we're trying to critically look outside of those areas as well for ways to create new housing outside of zones. The last thing I'll say was we're putting out an RFP to actually study this issue. What is the impact, not just on housing creation, housing cost, housing access, but on our local economy, whether that's through what people in the building trades who work on these issues are doing, or what it does for tourism, or a number of other things, or sustainability for that matter. So we're hoping to have a more robust picture of what has been the impact of districts at a little deeper dive than we were able from a data perspective to bring to that debate.
And this, Christine, you may or may not know the answer. This could be a K to 4 question. Do any other towns in Maine have the kind of historic districts that Portland has, and again, that we read about in the newspaper? I haven't heard a lot, but I mean, obviously you have. Anybody know the answer to that? Well, maybe. Okay, so they do exist in many towns in Maine. Okay, just Portland's is more high profile. The other question I'm just wondering is, I know there are a number of, Portland's probably somewhat unique in the number of citizen initiatives you have that have governed land use and buildings. And I'm just wondering how the city is processing I forgot the 3 or 4 that passed a couple of years ago, and how they apply to housing, to affordable housing, some of the issues we're talking about right now.
Yeah, that's a very timely question. Thank you. We have had a number of citizen referendums, and in November 2020, a number passed with implications for housing. The intent of a number of those was we had something passed called the Green New Deal. It is not the same as that other Green New Deal, but it addressed housing and from a number of different perspectives, both in terms of energy and green building requirements, but also it impacted how inclusionary zoning is done in the city, and made the requirements for the affordability levels and the percentage of affordability required for projects quite a bit higher. It was a big leap from what we had. And so obviously the intent of that referendum and the people who voted for that is wonderful intentions, and I respect that process, but it is it's a little challenging in the sense that it was a big change and we don't yet know the full extent of how it's going to impact housing production, because there's always the risk of you dial up requirements high enough and it actually makes some projects go away. And that's the line that we're always trying to find that balance of how to require or incentivize the right things without chasing development away either. And it's a little early to tell because many of the projects we've been reviewing were already sort of in the pipeline, not all of them. We've had some new projects come forward. I'd say one aspect, many of the projects we've reviewed since were kind of in process, and we're starting to see some of the ripple effect of it now. There was also a pandemic too, many disruptors at play in Portland. It's hard to see how it's all going to settle. I would say one thing I've noted, I have seen some projects kind of pull back and go back to the drawing board, and we don't know if they'll come back yet, or maybe they will. And then we've also seen increased requests for city funding from that housing trust and other tools we have to offset some of those requirements, which is, I don't know if that was the intent of the ordinance either, but that's where we are, and we're trying to figure out how to make that money go the farthest for the greatest good.
Additional questions from the commission? My question would be, does Portland, you may have mentioned this, I may have missed it. Does Portland have single family zoning?
There are zones where it is challenging. I don't think there's any zone where it's impossible to build something beside a single family home. And that accessory dwelling unit ordinance is citywide, and you can actually build 2 accessory dwelling units on a lot. And so in a roundabout sort of way, there's no zone where you couldn't do more than one. But that said, there are zones where there are higher hurdles, where it is not meant to be particularly easy to do that. I wouldn't say citywide. There's some zones it's super easy to do higher density housing here, of course. And part of that Recode Initiative I mentioned, where we're evaluating our codes, is looking at some of those neighborhoods tend to be farther out of the older parts of the city, and looking at the best ways to sort of graduate them upwards in a way to support more density that makes sense to make it work better. So the answer is sort of, but most zones in the city, you can find a way to do more than 1 unit, and some you can do 12 units on the same. So there's a big range, but we're working on sort of lowering the bar for what it takes and how much work it takes, how much land area it takes, et cetera, to get to multifamily.
And what about parking?
So parking, we recently, we have a number of ways that you can either reduce your parking requirement or just not have a parking requirement. And there's some, we do not have parking maximums, which some cities have. If you're in a quarter mile of a bus route, established bus route, you have no parking requirement. The default, if you are farther than a quarter mile, and quarter mile covers a lot, we're not that big of a city, quarter mile covers quite a bit of the city, is 1 space per residential unit. If that still seemed like too much for whatever the anticipated needs were, there are ways that applicants and developers can do studies to show that their anticipated need for parking is less. We also see places where people come in and say, we would like to build more. We actually have a requirement that says, well, we don't have a maximum here, but tell us why you need so much more. Tell us why it's a good use of space and why you're not doing other things like investing in maybe some transit improvements, things like that, to kind of keep all of us vigilant on trying to move that needle a bit. But in short, we have parking requirements, and but there are many exemptions for them. In addition to the transit one, historic properties don't have any, most changes of use don't have any, and there's a variety of other ways you can opt out if it's something you don't want or need.
Great,
Which we, and I'll just add, I think, we've talked, there's been a lot of discussion about, well, what do communities need, and education and incentives and requirements. I think this is one where this is one that's not always intuitive for what does it have to do with housing production? It has a lot to do with housing costs and housing production. And that's part of my job too, is to publicly talk about what's the relationship between the two, because I think it's not always an easy leap here or elsewhere in the state, but it has a lot to do with both cost of housing creation as well as how space is used in terms of trying to build density and walkable neighborhoods and things like that.
Yep. Great. Thank you. Any additional questions? I am seeing no more. Thank you for being here. Appreciate your participation in the hearing today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. What can I say? I like to be on time. We're
Excuse me, Mr. Speaker.
Commissioner Dufour.
This is municipal government. We've run on time. I know it's foreign to some of you. But I do want to thank the 4 speakers that joined us today for their time. They're very busy people. And I just want to summarize a couple of points that were included in the memo that we sent around. And if you have questions about that, please feel free to reach out to me. But I want to focus on 3 issues here. The first is municipalities are aware of the problem. And I think sometimes we get a reputation for, kicking our feet back, smoking cigars and drinking scotch. I mean, we're aware, we are in our communities. We're part of our communities. Each and every one of us lives in a community, and we're all part of that. So we are very aware of what's happening. And you see that we have, with the right tools in place, some flexibility, some financing, some education, some training, we have the smarts to figure out how this can be done. You have 4 very critical examples here of what's happening at the local level. We get it. We just need some flexibility. We need some help. We need education. And when I say education, I mean, we're dealing with human nature, and you heard it, and they're not kidding. Friendships, family relationships are lost because of somebody's willingness to serve on a planning board or be a member of a council or a select board. It is not easy. And that human nature part is very difficult for all of us to get around. I mean, you just look at the competing messages. One is communities adopt ADU ordinances so that we can have more affordable housing. Yet we have challenges with the legislature suggesting that we should not prohibit or limit or regulate short-term rentals. that has a huge impact in some communities on the availability of year-round housing. I can tell you in Hollowell, in the last 5 years, we've had full, year-round rental property, 13 units go to short-term. They're no longer available. We're talking about 13 to 15 and maybe even 20 people who can no longer rent in the city of Hollowell. But that's human nature. Those are things that we're going to need to assistance in overcoming. To Andrea's point with respect to Fort Fairfield, we sometimes find that people who are running away from something and want to come to these beautiful communities with open space and the ability to breathe, want to bring where they left with them. And that's also a problem. And sometimes it's viewed as NIMBYism. But in Fort Fairfield, the tradition of growing and harvesting potatoes is important. And people coming into those communities need to understand that this is Fort Fairfield. This is what you're coming into. And so to the extent that, and you've heard everyone today say, we're not interested in, the exclusionariness. We want people to come to our communities. That is economic vitality. Everybody understands that, but there's a delicate balance. And, our hope is that we can work together to find that balance so we can have more vibrant communities that are diverse, because diversity is also incredibly important. And I know, again, I don't want I'm glad this team of 4 came today, because I think they did an excellent job illustrating what municipal government actually is and the hurdles that we face trying to do good work on behalf of our residents. So I thank you for listening to them. Thank you for the thoughtful questions. And I am looking forward to getting to solutions that can be implemented and make sense. So thank you.
Thank you. And I would echo those sentiments. Thanks to the folks who joined us this afternoon. Really appreciate their time. One thing that we clearly did not dive into in the course of the discussion, and perhaps it might be worth revisiting, is the planning board process, because I think that's an interesting wrinkle in our consideration. I think probably it is the case across the state that every planning board is made up of volunteers. And, I would be curious, I see the mayor has rejoined us on video. Perhaps he can speak to this, because obviously a lot of changes just occurred in Auburn. But I presume those changes first went through the planning board, made up of volunteers. I know from my own experience in Biddeford, it's challenging for a board of folks who are volunteering their time to take the time to revisit ordinances and zoning rules when they have, the consistent pressure of just reviewing the next project that's on their table and not necessarily taking the time to go back and revisit things that have been on the books for a while, right? So I would be curious, Mr. Mayor, if you could provide us some insight on the planning board process and the challenges that exist there, or how you navigated those challenges.
Well, for the record, I was here the whole time. I just stopped the video so I could clean my home office. It's much earlier. I didn't think anybody wanted to watch that. So the planning board is difficult. Bluntly, it took me 4 years to find, recruit, coerce the right planning board members to apply, and for me to get them appointed, to the point where I have a super majority of individuals on the planning board that actually believe in growth and smart growth. It's a time constraint dealing with the planning board. Municipal government is a lot of work. I will say this, municipal government is all about doing your civic duty and volunteering. That really works if you're an independently wealthy individual with plenty of time on your hands, so you can volunteer, commit the hours needed for good work, okay? Our planning board doesn't get paid in Auburn. I'm trying to push to get them at least a modest $600 annual stipend. Some cities already have that. Some cities have more. That's something I think is important, but I think looking at recruitment, looking at fair compensation so people can actually serve in municipal government and spend the time needed to research is going to be critical. Other than that, you got to do it the old-fashioned way, through arm twisting, cajoling, and recruitment.
And do you, I guess one thing that sort of has come up for me as we've gone through this discussion and have considered this topic obviously for quite a while now, do you think it would be helpful if there was someone at the state level who was not there to tell people how to do things, but at least a state resource, an expert in zoning and land use that might be able to come to a planning board and provide like a 101 of how to have more inclusive zoning and or something like that that would be available for planning boards that wanted that resource.
Yeah, no. And here's why I say that. We have failed as a state, and this is going to upset a lot of people in this profession. I'm not, okay? I'm not in this profession. I'm just happen to be in the middle of it. We need to be looking outside of Maine for guidance and for exceptional leadership on the technical aspects of this, because we don't have the internal legacy knowledge to be effective. So, and I point out to the state of Maine comprehensive planning guide from 2002. It's not an applicable or based in reality or substantiated document. It has led us down the wrong path. And that's just one example. So no, I don't think so. Now, putting together on that same note, Mr. Speaker, putting together a resource of nationwide experts that are nonpartisan, that are think tanks and free, i.e. the Mercatus Institute from George Mason. They even flew up to Maine, spent time with us, executive summaries, data research. The only thing we had to do is cover their travel. It's a great resource. That would be beneficial. We need to be learning from other areas that have had success and not just Maine. We have to look a little bit more regional.
And in the case of Auburn, do you think that those folks were a game changer in terms of changing the hearts and minds of citizens and those members of your planning board?
Oh, absolutely. What they did is we had a lot of these thoughts and ideas, but we couldn't put them together. We couldn't fashion them in easily understandable chunks. And we didn't have any examples in order to substantiate what our thinkings would do. They came together, put it together, made it concise, and laid it out. Their only goal was to make their policies goals to have good zoning that empowers people, that's non-exclusive, and fully equitable zoning and urban planning and so forth. So yeah, it worked. It was the game changer.
Thank you. And I see the council.
And I found them through Google, by the way.
Thank you. Counselor.
I assume you mean Counselor Katarina, because I'm never sure who else is in.
Yes. We have no legal counsel, so you're the only counsel or counselor.
Counselor here. Yeah. We have a problem in Scarborough with recruiting people to the planning board. As you can imagine, with Scarborough Downs, our planning board, they were meeting once a week, sometimes twice a week, and people didn't re-sign up. So in the last, 6 weeks, 4 weeks, we've been short because people had vacations, whatever, so they weren't able to get a quorum. So yes, helping people to understand what the duties are of planning boards is essential. Unlike Mr. Levesque, I take the opposite tack. I'd like to see a state planning office reinstituted. And I do think we have a lot of skill within this state. I think it would be helpful for the state to provide expertise to municipalities and to town councils and planning boards. Let's face it, as counselors, town councils turn over every year, pretty much. And they always need to be re-educated on what's what. And, planning boards also. So I would like to see the state get a little more involved than they were. I know things got dismantled during a previous administration, which I thought was a huge mistake. But that's my opinion, and we welcome yours. Thanks.
Appreciate it. Oh,
we should give some hats off to the Maine Municipal Association. They do a lot of training with planning boards. That organization, being nonpartisan and away from state government, could be a very good vehicle to increase awareness and training at the planning board level.
Thank you both for entertaining continued conversation. Is there anything else from the commission for our presenters before we move on to the final agenda item, which is getting feedback from the public? Seeing Commissioner Jackson.
Yeah, real quick. So just something that like I've seen around. How are y'all managing like the vacation rental boom industry of not occupying residents? How has that impacted your municipalities? And how are you navigating that?
Counselor.
Thanks. That's a great question, Anthony. What Scarborough, we haven't had to regulate yet, in part because we've always had traditional rental areas, Pine Point, Higgins Beach being two of them. But we are seeing more and more of those turning over to Airbnb and VRBO and whatever. It hasn't seeped into regular downtown Scarborough yet, but what is going on is it has, let me back up a little, the short-term rental industry has taken some of these so-called winter rentals, because we used to be able to rent these places, say September, Labor Day to end of May, and people could live pretty cheaply there. You know, they get a couple $1,000 a week in the summer, but then you could rent them for $800 a month. They don't do that anymore. They're keeping them on VRBO and whatever. So there has been some diminution. And I do know from my work as a real estate broker that South Portland is an example, and Cape Elizabeth saw more South Portland, Cape. We did have people who were buying houses, taking them right out of the residential inventory and turning them into short-term rentals. And I know South Portland has been attempting to address that. So, you know, that is a great question though, because, and I know Portland, I'm looking at Christine because Portland was dealing with that also. People buying up multi-units and renting out each one of the apartments, you know, it's an issue, but we're keeping an eye on it. Scarborough, we haven't had to go anywhere yet, but if we do, I'll put my foot down.
Christine.
Yeah, just to add to that a little bit, I think there are a couple of ways we speak to it. There's no big second home ownership policy in place or anything like that, but in the way we deal with short-term rentals, owner-occupied short-term rentals have much more where there's owner on site, and at least one of the units or in the building has much more leniency, and they're much more generous than the ones that are not. And we're more restrictive on properties that are exclusively for Airbnb or short-term rentals. So that's one way we get out to it. So that with an eye towards not wanting too much of our housing stock to be dedicated to that use explicitly. And then the other one, relatively minor, I think, but our ADU standards, accessory dwelling unit standards, require that at least one of the units be owner occupied as well, with a nod to that same concern.
Great, thank you, Christine. Any other comments from the presenters? Seeing none. Any final questions? Seeing none. Thank you. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate it. Yes. And I'm sure we will definitely have more municipal input throughout the process. Obviously, you all are well represented here on the commission by Commissioner Dufour. So at this point, we will now take public comment. We will start with folks in the room, and then if there's anyone who's joined us over Zoom, we will turn to you directly after. So I would ask if you would like to join us here at the top, and Hillary will help with. There we go. Just ask that you state your name, your town, and you will have the attention of the commission.
Thank you very much, Senator Hickman, Speaker Fecteau, honorable members of the commission committee. My name is Cynthia Dill. I'm from Cape Elizabeth. I'm here in my personal capacity, but I did have the honor and privilege of serving in the House and Senate representing Cape Elizabeth. And one of the biggest challenges in 2007 under Governor Baldacci was a big push to consolidate school administrative districts, because the costs would be reduced, less administration would be more money going to the students, et cetera. And it was really difficult as a first-year freshman to convince the legislature that Cape Elizabeth, of all places, should get a special exception. But it boiled down to the numbers and common sense. And so I'm here today to just give you a perspective as a small business person from Cape Elizabeth that sometimes numbers and common sense mean that housing subsidies don't expand housing opportunities, but rather restrict. So in the case of the school districts, we were able to convince the legislature that there was a handful of schools that could show, based on the numbers, that it didn't make sense to consolidate school districts because it would cost more. We were already operating efficient districts and had good outcomes. So we were able to just make the case that not everybody should have a cookie cutter response. When it comes to housing, Cape Elizabeth, as you may have read in the paper, is deliberating over a low-income housing project on the town green in our town. It's literally right across the street from my house. I can see it, and it will result in a public skating rink being paved and a gigantic building, built where it had been approved for a commercial subdivision as part of a village feel downtown area. And I'm opposed to it. And the reason I'm opposed is because my husband and I cobble together a variety of jobs like many Maine people to be able to live in Cape Elizabeth. And Cape Elizabeth's a beautiful town and we love it, and it educates our kids, and it's a very good place to live. It's a great community, and I feel part of it. We're part of the local economy. We have an Airbnb. I have an office in my house. We're a small business and we have a multi-use building. The low-income housing project, it's more about the deal than it is about our community, because it's being sold as housing for the workforce. And yet in Cape Elizabeth, if you're just a numbers person, the local household median income, the median household income for Cape Elizabeth is $123,000. It's the second most affluent town in the state. That's just a number. I mean, you can have a moral judgment about that, but that's a fact. And so by restricting this low-income housing project to low income defined by HUD of less than $42,000, 20% of our population, our workforce, our teachers, our police officers will be ineligible because they make too much. And so it's an answer to a problem that we don't have. Our housing problem is we have seniors who are selling their homes. 90% of homeowners in Cape Elizabeth own their own homes. Property has increased in value, like to beat the band. Okay, if you're selling your home, you're not in a crisis. You've realized a substantial capital gain. But what we need are apartments for seniors. And so these apartments will be one-bedroom apartments. They're not for families, or there'll be for families who have to squeeze into one bedroom. And for seniors, they don't have any garages. So it doesn't make sense to the numbers, but what it makes sense for is for the investors, because now we have a situation where there's subsidies available at every single level. At the municipal level, the developers are asking for a TIF. And so therefore, a small business like myself will be paying for this for-profit low-income housing and not solving our housing problem. But more importantly, it'll redefine affordable housing so that people like me who want to make affordable housing, the market is skewed, because in order to, if people can only make up to $42,000, that means in order to have it be a profitable adventure, you have to get subsidy. And so there's subsidies at the local level, there's subsidies at the state level with publicly backed debt, and then at the federal level with tax credits. So here we have these programs that are supposed to be aimed towards helping underprivileged people achieve housing, going to Cape Elizabeth because the real estate investment is less risky. So the mortgage will be securitized at a higher bond level. The mortgage interest loans will be less, the tax credit, everything is about the investor, that we're using HUD definitions to get all these economic benefits. And what our town is left with is, and what I'm left with is across the street paving, our public lot and creating this monstrosity that can't house our workforce. So I'm advocating that the zoning law, rather than be changed just for a low-income housing project that meets all the Wall Street and state subsidy checks and boxes. Instead, be based on our community values and make the zoning less exclusive across the board, so that everybody in the town center can have the density, the height, the setbacks, the kinds of relaxed zoning that we really need to encourage entrepreneurial creation of housing. I mean, why not have small business people like me develop housing for our community instead of, these, what I call the for-profit, low-income housing industrial complex. So with that, I just want to offer defense that not everybody who's against a low-income housing project is against low-income people. Sometimes it just doesn't make sense, and the numbers and the money could be better spent, better invested by the people of Cape Elizabeth to have higher quality housing that meets our housing needs, and for the taxpayers who are subsidizing one of the most affluent towns to create housing for, wealthy white people is really what it boils down to. Old, wealthy white people who are going to be selling their property and moving into subsidized housing. So I hope you consider suburban towns in the mix of all the housing conversation. And I'm happy to take any questions or any shots.
Thank you, Ms. Dill, for being here. Any questions from the commission? Seeing none.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you for your hard work.
Thanks. Any additional members of the public?
If I may, Speaker,
Yes,
are you going to move to the online?
I think so.
Okay. I was going to ask if anyone online could just raise their hand if you plan to testify, because I do know we had some people who jumped on the Zoom because we had some difficulties with the YouTube live stream earlier. And then if anybody is not able to use the raise hand function, to just write in the chat that you'd like to testify, and that way we'll know to bring you in when the time is up.
Ms. Rizzler, am I seeing everyone that's in the Zoom room on the screen right now?
You are not.
Okay. I was gonna say, I don't think anyone on the screen at least is planning on testifying, but that makes sense.
Yes. So we currently have 2 people who look like they would like to testify remotely.
Okay.
If we could start with Eamon Dundon, and I do apologize for mispronouncing any names.
Hello, good afternoon, Speaker Fecto and Senator Hickman and members of the commission. My name is Eamon Dundon. I live in Portland and I'm the Director of Advocacy at the Portland Regional Chamber of Commerce. I'll want to start off by saying I wasn't planning to speak today. We're working on some longer testimony to this commission that will speak to a number of different recommendations that we would support coming out of this commission, and we hope to have that to you within a week or so. And it might come back at a future meeting and talk through some of those. I did just want to comment today briefly to respond to some of what was said from the panelists, specifically around the inclusionary zoning provisions in Portland and some of the challenges those have brought to housing production in our state's biggest city. And I think it really illustrates an important point about the work of this commission and the work that will take place in municipalities to address our housing shortage. I really think about housing production occurring only when a seesaw is in balance. And the 2 ends of those seesaws are the zoning code and what that zoning actually looks like. And then on the other end, you have the sort of regulations that are placed on top of housing that is built, like inclusionary zoning, like historic districts, like impact fees, et cetera. And to create that perfect environment for housing production to really work and to get the numbers we need to address the shortages in Maine, that seesaw really has to be in perfect balance. So you could have, the most permissive zoning code in the world that allowed, big multifamily buildings to go up all over a town. But if you have very, very strict restrictions on top of that in terms of what that housing has to look like and the mandates on developers in terms of the affordability, you're not going to get any housing production. And similarly, you could have no restrictions on development, but a very restrictive zoning code, and you also won't see that production. And so I think, the reason why this is important to talk about in the context of inclusionary zoning is, in Portland, we had an inclusionary zoning requirement in place for a number of years at 10%. So 10% of the units had to be set aside. I believe it was at 80% of AMI. Jeff Levine was there when it was implemented, so he might have some clear remembering of that. So we were seeing, a good amount of housing production in the city. I just pulled the numbers the other day, and from the years 2014, which was about a year before the inclusionary zoning went into effect, through the year 2020, we were seeing on average 482 units of housing approved by the planning board in Portland every year, which I would love to see more, but that's a pretty good number, and definitely does a lot to help the housing shortage that we're facing, really acutely, obviously, in the southern Maine, greater Portland region. Since that regulation, the increase to 25% in inclusionary zoning went into effect under Citizens Initiative last year, that pipeline has really dropped off steeply. And Christine Grimando mentioned in her remarks, that there are some pipeline effects to that, and we have seen some projects approved this year that are not subject to that 25%. But in fact, we have seen 0 units in the 9 months that ordinance has been in effect. We've seen 0 units of housing approved that are subject to that ordinance. And so to me, it's a very clear indication if we go from 482 to 0, even considering the lag time of the housing production pipeline, it's very concerning to see such a steep drop off in housing production in our state's biggest city. And so one of the recommendations that I think we're hoping to bring forward through our written testimony that I want to submit shortly is not for the state to preempt municipalities and say you can't do inclusionary zoning, but for the state to sort of assert some reasonable guidelines around regulations around housing, so we don't go too far in one direction in terms of mandates on housing production that lead to nothing happening. And so one of the model policies I'm hoping you all will look to, and I'll include links to it in my written testimony. But Virginia, for instance, has great state enabling legislation around inclusionary zoning, which caps that percentage at which municipalities can sort of place an inclusionary zoning requirement, so that it doesn't swing it too far in one direction and adversely impact housing production. So I just wanted to get that in there today while Christine's exchange with the commission was fresh in everyone's mind about inclusionary zoning, because I do think it's really an important aspect of this whole issue to address. And we'll definitely follow up within the next couple of days with some written testimony that goes more into detail, talks about some peer cities that have implemented really high inclusionary zoning requirements that have also seen a big drop off since that time, and some of the history in Portland. Because we have had discussions about raising that in the past, and ultimately, on the advice of city staff and through analysis was determined that the market really could not bear such a high number. I think we're now seeing the effects of that. I don't think that the staff or the council would have ever put something through like this, but the voters did. And like Christine mentioned, with good intentions to get more affordable housing, but really not talking to any of the people that actually provide that housing, and that is our development community, from the affordable side all the way up to the sort of luxury market rate stuff that you also see in Portland. So thank you, and happy to take any questions, but we'll also follow up soon.
Thank you, Mr. Dundon. Any questions from the commission for Mr. Dundon? Seeing none. Thank you. And we appreciate if you would provide us with written testimony at some point. That'd be helpful.
Thank you.
Yes, George Rowe, is this, am I ready to go here?
Yes, we can hear you. We can't see you. If you don't want to be seen, that's fine.
Yeah, well,
If
because of
if you
my-
do want to be seen, feel free to take turn your video on.
Okay, well, thank you for that offer. My internet connection can sometimes be a little spotty, so I would prefer to just keep the bandwidth issues aside. So I'll be a headless voice here. So my name is George Rowe, and I live in Portland, Maine, in the West Bayside neighborhood. And I spoke at your first meeting and had a lively exchange with the panel, the commission. So one little outstanding matter from that meeting is I just wanted to note that pointing out the sort of the NIMBY quality to this issue, I had just was a fairly, I thought, uncontroversial, reference that Mr. Topman, as a member of the affordable housing industry in our state, was in effect benefiting from our exclusionary zoning policies in the state, because he lived in an exclusionary zone that was zoned exclusively for effectively single family homes. And he kind of challenged that. And of course, that exchange is all, recorded, but he sort of basically denied that he was in that situation and suggested that I was mistaken. And one of the reasons he was able to do that with a straight face was he had just sold his home 3 weeks before that meeting for double what he had paid for it 8 years previously. And I was very disappointed that he kind of withheld that fact from the commission, because I thought it was very relevant. I was not aware at the time that he had just sold his home. It hadn't shown up on my radar, but it did as soon as I sat down in that meeting afterwards. But the reason I bring this up again, and again, I'm not trying to put Mr. Topman on the spot, but as people like Cynthia Dill, who just spoke to you a short while ago, and even the town manager from Fort Fairfield, basically homeowners are effectively the voters in our state. They vote in much, much higher numbers than renters, and they have a vested interest in showing up for elections. Their voices have a huge outside weight in how we create policy in the state on any issue, but most of all on housing issues. And we have created a system in this country where we are relying as a society more and more as housing equity as people's retirement plan. Basically, we have created for decades a system where people are expecting that if they jump through the hurdles and the burdens of home ownership, that they're going to be rewarded with not just beneficial tax policy. You can flip a home today and not pay capital gains tax on that enormous price appreciation that you may or may not have experienced during your period of home ownership. You literally need to be selling a multi-million-dollar home before any kind of capital gains impacts flow to you. So what we've done is incentivized homeowners to really bend over backwards to be homeowners if they can afford it, and then to really ruthlessly defend their capital gains. And part of that is making sure that two things happen. Nobody builds anything near you that would affect the value of your home, i.e., a nuclear power plant, a cement factory, or a 4-unit apartment building next door that might be rented to, college students who would be rowdy and have a party on weekends, or Black people, people of color, who you and your neighbors and future buyers may or may not perceive as quote unquote bringing down the neighborhood. But they also, and the other important piece is they don't want competition for the product that they own. If you make more housing in Fort Fairfield right now, which is losing population and has been losing population decade after decade, since basically soon after the beginning of the 1970s, then you are terrified that there's somebody who's going to build housing, brand new housing next to you, that is going to be more desirable than your older, not renovated, not fresh and new, with modern appliances and modern building systems and modern and up to code. You're terrified that somebody else is going to bring in new product that's going to be more desirable for the people that are either moving to your community or just moving around your community. So you want to prevent competition, and you want to prevent any value loss in your immediate backyard. And what that has done is it's made it impossible to build new housing. of any kind, market rate, affordable, middle, missing middle, whatever you want to call it, it has put a huge damper on a highly important commodity. And, our highly regulated land use system, which is, a number of people, the Mayor Levesque talked about the need to deregulate that system. And that's a painful word because that's a very ideologically charged term. I am all for government regulation. I think when we regulate, we have to be smart. We have to be smart about the consequences, and we have to be smart about what our goals and ambitions are. Most land use regulation in our communities in Maine and throughout the country are focused on limiting supply, preventing new product, protecting homeowners from anybody that might get over the wall. And there's all kinds of good reasons sometimes that you can use as a pretext. Septic regulations are a great example. Earlier this afternoon, you heard somebody say, oh, septic regulation, that's completely neutral. Those are good things to have. That's objective regulation. Well, it is and it isn't. It can be used, and it has often been used, to basically as a pretext to create large lot zoning, which is ubiquitous across Maine and across New England. And those large lots are justified under sewage regulations, when in effect, from a technical point of view, you do not need a 15,000 square foot lot for a septic field. It's simply not needed, but that's the justification. And so, I recommended to the chair, Commissioner Hickman, that he recommend to all of you that you read, maybe as a group, the book that came out in 2013 called Snob Zones. And it was done by a New York Times journalist who had spent a lot of time reporting on local zoning battles across New England, Connecticut, of course, being the most, but also other places in northern New England, including Maine. There's actually a great chapter on Millbridge, Maine, which ended up in court, that battle. And it was over a very small, very modest housing project for agricultural workers that was geared towards Latino community of farm workers. And the Millbridge, Maine community erupted in opposition to that modest project, and it ended up in court. And it basically has had a chilling effect. That was roughly circa 2009, 2010, has had a huge chilling effect on housing production in various parts of Maine ever since. So what I'm asking you to do is to look much more deeply at this NIMBY phenomenon and to tie it directly to housing policy as we've actually experienced. For example, I live in Portland. Portland has used historic preservation and green space and conservation land as pretexts for harming housing production. Why? Because those two things are politically extremely easy to pitch to communities as complete 100% good things. Who would argue against tearing down beautiful old buildings? Who would argue against new parks or new open space, new green space? But ideologically, what's going on beneath the surface is the same NIMBY phenomenon that drove Cynthia Dill to present to you tonight and argue with a straight face that having new housing production literally in her own backyard is simply an attempt for Wall Street to make more money without any other more important benefits accruing to the community. And it's obvious how that works. What's ironic is Nathan Zanton, the gentleman who was behind the housing project that Cynthia Dill was attacking earlier today. He has $1 million condo on Munjoy Hill in Portland, and he himself was arguing over the last year for stringent historic preservation regulation on Munjoy Hill, which used to be a traditional working class blue collar community to prevent new housing from being created in that community, and literally padding his own real estate investment. He is literally doing the thing that he objects to Cynthia Dill doing in Cape Elizabeth, but it's okay for him to do it in Portland. It's somehow bad for Cynthia Dill to do the exact same thing to protect the home equity value of her home investment there, but it's perfectly fine for him to do it in his own backyard. And that's why I brought up Mr. Topman at your last meeting. And that's why I'm bringing this up now, is we have so many layers of hypocrisy in this issue, where everyone has their own interests at heart in arguing for one thing or another. Today, we've heard a number of different corners of the affordable housing industry asking for more state subsidies. Now, those state subsidies are wonderful if they're implemented well. What's been happening in Maine is those subsidies are largely wasted because they get the product of those subsidies gets watered down by zoning and by this NIMBYism, that we end up having very, very expensive subsidies that don't produce a lot of units, but they make the system continue to function just enough that we, with a straight face, can look at our affordable housing production and say, oh, there's something good happening, when in effect, what's really happening is really bad. And I know this for a fact in Portland, because you see it time and time again, where the politics of housing and housing production undercut those subsidies. And that's what you need to look at. For example, Avesta has a project.
Mr. I just want to quickly chime in.
I'm wrapping it up.
Okay, we are going to attempt to stay on schedule. We have 3:45 as our discussion of next steps. You are the last member of the public to
I'd like
provide
to
input,
wrap up.
so I'll give you a
like to wrap
3-minute
up.
warning. All yours.
No, I appreciate it. And again, I don't have a timer, so I'm not quite aware of how this is going. But so what I wanted to just note is to take that Avesta project. It's on St. John Street, right beneath the Western Prom. I can certainly give you guys an email of that information. But recently, that project was approved by the Portland Planning Board last summer. And they admitted, the Avesta development team admitted, that Maine State Housing, their affordable housing subsidy program, prevented them from taking full advantage of the zoning envelope that was available to them because of various rules and technical things relating to cost caps. And those cost caps resulted in a smaller project for that specific site than what might have been possible under Portland zoning code. And that's the kind of thing that you guys need to look into, because it doesn't matter if communities produce more zoning opportunities if the affordable housing community gets hurt at the main housing level, when the subsidies have to be basically watered down and made less effective and less efficient because of other sets of rules. So that's what I'm hoping you're going to look into soon as part of your recommendations. And that's what I'm looking forward to hearing from you guys as you continue your work. So thank you. Thank you so much for all the great time you've given me. And I look forward to your future meetings. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe. Any questions from the commission for Mr. Rowe? Seeing none. Thank you for joining us this week as well. Appreciate it. Hillary, I don't believe we have anyone left in queue. We do not. Great. So just our final item before we adjourn for the day, discussion of next steps. If there are any information requests that the commission has for our legal analysts, now would be the time to bring those up. And just as a reminder, next week we'll be meeting again, and it will be on the topic that we intended to have for our second meeting, which obviously didn't happen in this order, but it'll be regarding the goal that we have to look at the historical role and the present role that racism and redlining and so forth have played in zoning. And we have a number of presenters who will be with us next week for that important meeting, which I think will really provide us with some good direction on how we will continue to do the work before the commission. So with that, any questions, any comments, any requests? Commissioner Dufour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have to participate remotely next week because our executive committee is having its two-day retreat in Presque Isle. So I didn't want my absence on a very important matter to be categorized as anything but not available. So I will be available via remote means.
Thank you. Any other question? Commissioner Pingree.
Thank you. And actually, like Kate, I have to be remote next week for a childcare oriented issue. I can feel the pain of others. I just wanted to actually give people a heads up. I'm sure it was noted, but Greg Payne, who presented at our first commission meeting, is actually now a member of the governor's staff, leading on housing policy. So he has changed roles. I won't out him, but I think Jeff is going to take over serving Greg's role, leading that coalition. And I just want to kind of offer Greg, and I've talked to the speaker about this, to help Hillary and others as we think about these big policy issues from a state level. He is now on the job and thinking actively about how he can support our work. And obviously, I think Hillary's provided some good resources. I think in the next couple of meetings, like as we get to the solution stage, there's a lot of suggestions. I think Kate's memo was very helpful, but like, how do we now look at what are other states that have done this well? What's the patchwork we have in Maine? What are the ideas we can put on the table? So just wanted to I have talked to the speaker about that, and we do look forward to just being helpful in any way we can, because obviously we all want to get to an outcome at the end that has some concrete ideas of how we can move this forward.
Thank you. And we're obviously very excited for Greg and his new role. One request that I would have, it came up during, I think, the presentation by the mayor from Auburn. He made reference to revenue sharing and housing production being tied to the amount that municipalities receive for revenue sharing. That is a very interesting point. I would be curious to know more about that, because I think clearly we don't want to have any disincentives currently in state law that are preventing housing from being built. So I would be interested in learning more about that. And if we can get information, Hillary, on that, that'd be great. Anything else?
Yeah, I had.
Oh, sorry, Commissioner Jackson.
No, it's all good. So I had requested like a breakdown by racial demographics on one of the documents we got on the first meeting. I don't know if like we're saving that for next week, but it's like specifically the 2021 Maine housing profile, like where it has the extremely low income renter households. Like if that was available, I think that would be good data to have, especially going into this next meeting.
And I would clarify that was that presentation was by Mr. Merrill. So I would pose the request for more information on that to Mr. Brennan, if he doesn't mind.
Yep, I'll be happy to follow up and provide what we can.
Great, thank you. Do I see any other hands? Commissioner Cooper Ryder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is really a process question, but there's a nice document that came to us today, which is a summary of MMA's Affordable Senior Workforce Housing Working Group meeting. And if we had questions about that, how should we present those questions?
Commissioner Dufour.
You could email me directly if you'd like, and I can respond to the entire team
Great.
rather than answer them now when everybody wants to take off.
Sure, I wasn't thinking now, but I didn't know if it was appropriate to just email the questions, maybe send them to Hillary and she can share.
Well, if it works, perhaps for the sake of efficiency, if you have questions related to this document specifically, it's probably best to direct them to Commissioner Dufour. I would ask that at the next meeting or the meeting thereafter, if Kate wouldn't mind providing us a rundown of the questions that were posed, if there are any, and what the answers to the questions are.
And I'll submit it to you all in advance of one of the
Okay.
meetings in writing.
Okay, perfect. And we should all have, you have Kate's information. Perfect. Awesome. Yeah, this is thank you for putting this together. Very helpful. Commissioner Spalding.
Thank you. I was just I was wondering if all of the speakers for next week's meeting are already lined up. And I mean, it sounds like we've got some really good.
We have a couple speakers already lined up. We are still waiting to coordinate with one last group to see if someone will be able to join us or not. But certainly anytime there is any question of agenda or suggestions, I would certainly urge you to connect directly with Senator Hickman and Speaker Fecteau. And if there is room and they'd like to add that to the agenda, they'll certainly reach out to me and I can help coordinate with whomever to see about it happening.
I think to this point, we have someone from the Urban Institute,
Yes.
who's an expert on zoning and land use. Someone from the eviction lab at
Correct.
Princeton,
Yes.
or not Princeton?
Yes, Princeton.
Princeton, who will be presenting as well. And I think Andy O'Brien, who did a presentation before Labor and Housing earlier this year, will also be with us for historical, the history related to Maine specifically. And I think Commissioner Jackson will also be presenting. Is that right, Commissioner Jackson, or am I putting you on the spot?
A little bit on the spot, but I'll get with y'all and
Okay.
I'll get with y'all, see where I can plug in.
Thank you. Awesome. Anything
Can I
else?
just follow up?
Yep. Sorry.
Yeah, that sounds really, really great. And I'm really looking forward to next week. And I guess one of the things I heard Mayor Levesque suggest we look into a little bit more was, I think he said Salim Firth from the Mercatus Center at GMU at George Mason. And I don't know if that's a possibility, but I quickly was Googling him and it looks like he addressed the New Hampshire legislature at one point on this particular topic. And so that might be somebody for a future meeting.
Yeah, I agree. We definitely look at extending an invitation for one of our future meetings. Yeah. Anything else? Senator Hickman, do you have anything else before we wrap up?
I am enthralled by all of this information and the dedication of not just the commissioners. I want to thank all the presenters today, which I was remiss in doing earlier, for bringing their expertise and concerns and questions and insight and wisdom to us. This is a great group of people, and I look forward to whatever work product we produce for the legislature's consideration. So thank you. And Hillary, you're awesome, as is your staff.
I appreciate that. I do want to mention for members of the public who are watching via the YouTube live stream, I know we did have some technical difficulties at the very beginning of the meeting. So this meeting is being archived and we will send it out to the IP list. So if anybody missed those first few minutes while they were trying to find the new and updated YouTube link, we will make sure we get that out to you as well.
And I would just add, we appreciate everyone's patience as we continue to navigate doing our meetings in a new and innovative way, having this hybrid setup. So thank you. I know that as a member of leadership, this is we're the guinea pigs for like what we do moving forward. So it's been very helpful to have a front row seat to this as we have these conversations about how we're going to do things in the next legislative session. I've been able to have some firsthand experience, which has been very helpful. So I really appreciate that. Any final thoughts? Seeing none, I think we are good to adjourn. Thank you.
Thank you all.